Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon or good evening, as the case may be. My name is Feng Daxuan, and I'm the coordinator of today's event, an event to honor one of the greatest female scientists of the 20th century, Madame Wu Jianxiong. The genesis of this event began with Nanjing University's Alumni Association United States, or NUAAUS, when Zhang Chenning, the president, noticed that the United States Postal Service, USPS, issued a stamp to commemorate Madame Wu as one of the greatest nuclear scientists, female greatest scientists of the 20th century. The organization, which consists of more than 20,000 members in North America, realized the profound importance and relevance of Madame Wu, not just to her alma mater, which is the National Central University, which eventually morphed into Nanjing University, but to humanity in general. So NUAAUS wanted to leverage this occasion of Madame Wu's 120th birth year and Nanjing University's 120th anniversary to celebrate the great achievements of Madame Wu. It's interesting, my mother is 1 year younger than Madame Wu. Not surprisingly, that because of the enormous and deep impact of Madame Wu's in physics, that the two of the world's most important professional organizations where Madame Wu were intellectually deeply connected with, and that is the American Physical Society, APS, and the Chinese Physical Society, CPS, it gives me profound pleasure to use that the leadership of both APS and CPS are gathered here today. They are Professor Yong-Ki Kim of the University of Chicago, Sylvester Gates of the University of Maryland, and Zhang Qian of Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and of course, 3 of his special representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that APS and CPS made this decision clearly renders today's event not just being truly important, which it is, but that it becomes historical. Ladies and gentlemen, I now take my responsibility as the moderator of the event to solemnly declare the opening of this event. So without further ado, allow me to request the first speaker of today's event, Professor Yong-Ki Kim, the 2024 president of APS, to deliver her presentation. Professor Kim, the floor or the screen is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Well, thank you for kind invitation. As you heard, I'm Yong-Ki Kim from University of Chicago, and I'm currently the vice president of the American Physical Society, APS, and will be present in 2024. The society is truly honored to co-sponsor the International Forum on the 110th birth anniversary in honor of Madame Jianxiong Wu, who was its president in 1975. She made many contributions to our society, which remain critical today. Her election and achievements as a president of APS helped to ensure that all physicists, independent of race, nationality, and gender, are welcome in our community. While preparing these remarks, I discovered a few personal connections. I learned that C.S. Wu and I are the same height, 4'11". I'm a Korean, so we are both a 4'11" Asian women. And you can look at me. So, because this gives you a sense of her size. Yet, despite her small stature, she was a true giant in physics and was an intellectual powerhouse. I also learned that my mother-in-law, who received a PhD in physics from Columbia University, worked for CSU for several years during the 1950s. The two families had dinners together in Chinatown, where Dr. Wu bought the children, including her son, Vincent, wooden Chinese puzzles to keep them entertained and perhaps quiet. So I'm so thrilled that I have a personal connection to this inspiring physicist who has opened doors for all of us. I have confidence in humankind. I believe we will one day live together peacefully. Those are the words of Madame Wu. And like her, I wish for that same future, a day when we can all live together peacefully. We are not there yet, and the path to getting there is challenging. Still, I believe that the story of Madame Wu can give us all hope for the future. So let me take just a few minutes to share with you how I think her story can inspire us to that goal. For us to live together peacefully, we need to overcome discrimination. And Madame Wu's story can give us hope. The 1940s were not an easy time for women to get a PhD in science. It is still difficult for a woman to advance in science. So at a time when women were not welcomed into the halls of academia, Madame Wu nevertheless earned a PhD in physics from Berkeley. At a time when the physics community was dominated by men, she excelled. And now her name is frequently mentioned alongside those very men, the giants of physics like Rabi, Fermi, and Feynman. The US Postal Service recognized her by issuing a forever stamp of her. She was even an answer to a clue on the TV show, game show Jeopardy. So how did she do it? How did this 4'11" female Chinese immigrant overcome the intense discrimination of her time to become a global physics star? I think the answer is that she simply wouldn't abide discrimination. She was accepted and planned to pursue her PhD at the University of Michigan, but when she learned that she would not let women use the front entrance, she turned it down and went elsewhere. That decision took strength, it took conviction, and it took her confidence in herself that enabled her to say no. And that's a lesson for all of us. We need to be willing to say no more when we witness any discrimination among our institutions, among our colleagues, or among our fellow citizens. For us to live together peacefully, we need a strong leadership. And Madame Wu's story can give us hope. Thoughtful leadership doesn't come from those who demand power. It comes from those who earn their position and who receive the respect and support of their community. And that is certainly the story of Madame Wu. When C.N. Yang and T.D. Lee went to her to discuss the possibility of her doing an experiment to evaluate their theory, they didn't go to her because she was an Asian. They didn't go to her because they thought she would be easy to persuade or that she had time to spare. They went to her for one reason, because she was the best. She was the thoughtful leader in her field. And when the national community of physicists needed to elect a new leader of their organization, my organization, the American Physical Society, they turned to Madame Wu, and she was elected to become the first female president of APS. Among so many of her firsts, that first certainly resonates with me. She became the first female president of APS, the organization that I was elected to lead nearly 50 years later. For us to live together peacefully, we need to be open to change. And Madame Wu's story can give us hope. So many people in this country live in information silos that work as echo chambers, confirming biases and limiting the opportunity for a broader view. The result is an intolerance for compromise, for growth of perspective, and for change. There are times when science itself has had too narrow a view and someone had to challenge the status quo. But despite the considerable difficulty in bringing about change, Madame Wu did just that. Her scientific pursuits challenged the status quo. One experiment of hers in particular, her work that examined the symmetry and parity through beta decay, was a truly beautiful experiment that completely upended our understanding of nature. So Madame Wu's work challenged, it upended, and it transformed. And there is a powerful lesson in her discovery. We all need to be open to insights that challenge our perspective. We can't simply retreat into our respective silos, or we will miss discoveries that are the genuine truth of the nature. I have a final insight from Madame Wu's life that I would like to share, and it's a complex one. We need to embrace the role that science must play in building a better world. Throughout her life, Madame Wu witnessed the full range of how science can impact the world. Working on the Manhattan Project and seeing the aftermath, she learned that the very physics that can bring about the end of a world war can also lead to the world's destruction. She was deeply dismayed by the use of the nuclear weapons that scientists had created. And it was reported that she urged Chiang Kai-shek not to go down the path of nuclear weapons. She could have responded in a variety of ways to that dismay. For example, she could have decided that science should never again be in a position where it involves itself in activities that impact society. Some colleagues have that belief and think that science should be pursued for science's sake, not involve itself in the murky world of applications of policy. I disagree, so did Madame Wu. In fact, instead of turning away from the world, she leaned in. And so should we all. I will give you just one example, climate change. Global warming was predicted by scientists. The evidence has been accumulated by scientists, and scientists must continue to engage in developing the solutions that can help us avoid the worst outcomes. That idea that science must address the challenges of our times is one that Madame Wu firmly believed. And that is why in 1975, as the president of the American Physical Society, she met with the then president of the United States, Gerald Ford, and urged him to establish an Office of Science and Technology Policy. President Ford did that, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy exists to this day and has played a role in US science policy for the last 9 US presidents. I've shared with you why the personal story of what Madame Wu gave her good reason to believe peaceful coexistence is possible. But there's one thing I left out. If you think it takes a hero to realize the impossible, well, maybe so, because you see, the Chinese characters for Madame Wu's name, Xie Qian, translates to strong hero. That is the woman she was. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for this truly heartwarming comment. I think we all could take that deep down in our heart. Next, I'd like to introduce to you the president of the Chinese Physical Society, Professor Zhang Jie, who is also the former president of Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Professor Zhang.
Okay, distinguished presidents Yong-Ki Kim and Sylvester Jules Gates, colleagues from the American Physical Society and the Chinese Physical Society, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is my great pleasure to deliver a speech on behalf of the Chinese Physical Society at the commemoration of the 110th birth anniversary of Professor Wu. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Jonathan Bagger, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Physical Society, for agreeing to jointly co-sponsor this commemoration with the Chinese Physical Society. This year marks the 110th birth anniversary of Professor Zhenxun Wu. We gather here today to celebrate her significant contributions and achievements in the world of science and extend our thoughts and deepest remembrance. My speech is titled Zhenxun Wu, a phenomenal exemplar for our generation. It is inspired by a poem by Li Qingzhao, one of the greatest Chinese female poets who lived in the 12th century of the Song dynasty in ancient China. The poem not only coincides with the Chinese character of Professor Wu's name, Zhenxun, translating to strong hero, but also speaks to Wu's greatness. To begin with my speech, I would like to borrow the Chinese character of Xiang from Professor T.D. Lee's May 30th, 1997 memorial at Wu's commemoration service held at Peking University the year when she passed away. The word Xiang means to remember and to miss. Li wrote it in calligraphy to recognize her extraordinary accomplishments in the world of science. I chose the Chinese character Xiang today because it also perfectly demonstrates how much we have missed Professor Wu in the last 25 years since her passing away. Within the character, Li listed 4 of Wu's most significant research publications. The 2 on the top were published in 1949 and 1950, respectively, namely the beta ray spectra of 64 copper and the recent investigation of the shape of beta ray spectra in these 2 papers. Wu disproved the previous fallacies and made the first confirmation of Enrico Fermi's 1934 theory of beta decay based on her meticulous experiments, pushing the study of beta decay to a new stage. The third paper in the middle right is the experimental test of the parity conservation to beta decay published on February 15th, 1957, in which Wu, with accurate measurements, overturned the law of conservation of parity for the first time and established the violation of particle-antiparticle charge conjugation symmetry. In this paper, Wu not only demonstrated Zhengdao Li and Zhenying Yang's hypothesis of the non-conservation of parity in weak interactions, but more importantly, he refuted the 2 foundation stones of physics with her indisputable experimental results forever altering our view of the universe. This paper validates Wu's great confidence in her measurements and her in-depth insight into the laws of physics hidden behind the phenomena. The fourth paper is the experimental test of the conserved vector current theory on the beta spectra of B12 and N12, published in 1963. This paper was the first in the history of physics to experimentally confirm the close connection between the electromagnetic and the weak interactions, setting the cornerstones for the unification of those two basic forces into the electroweak force. Li reckoned that Wu's work was of the same significance as the work of Andrew Marie Ampere and Michael Faraday in establishing the link between electricity and magnetism. In addition to the above revolutionary publication, Wu has made an overwhelming amount of contributions in the fields of science, most of which were related to the fundamental problems of physics, including internal bremsstrahlung, the significant effect of 135 xenon on the nuclear fission chain reaction, double beta decay, hidden parameter interpretation of quantum mechanism, positron, and ultra-low temperature nuclear physics. It is universally acknowledged by leading physicists of the time that Wu is the only physicist who has never made any experimental error. Such a reputation is inarguably the highest compliment for any experimentalist. Besides her meticulous approach to experiments, Wu had a piercing insight into important fundamental physics problems. It was widely acknowledged at the time that breakthroughs in experiments were usually restricted within the boundary of theories. However, Wu has never hindered by those common sense, nor intimidated by the authoritative theories of the time, which is quite remarkable and even utterly heroic and courageous. In Professor Zheng Yang's inscription in honor of Professor Wu in 1997, he noted, Professor Wu was known for her rigorous experiments, but there was much more to her success. Why was she the one to back the trend and to take on the complicated experimental tests for parity conservation? It was because she saw what others failed to see, which was the necessity of testing parity conservation. If not disproving it, this is what made her stand out. This comment made by Yang is extremely incisive, although it is often said that the practice is the sole criteria for testing truth. Few people like Wu, who are remarkably independent-minded, can keep their heads down and work hard to carry this scientific spirit forward. Wu was never dedicated to anything more than the pursuit of truth. She always wanted to go into the whys and wherefores of nature. Once she said, "It is the physical universe which appears to be bizarre and motley by the look of it, but seems to be built around some mysterious and wondrous laws that keeps me deeply fascinated." She designed and conducted experiments based on her own predictions, during which she addressed difficulties with determination and wisdom and explored the truth regardless of her personal gain or loss. Wu is a scientist in its true sense. and her spirit should be appreciated and carried on by this generation of scientists. 110 years ago, Jian Xunwu was born in the town of Liuhe in Taichang, Jiangsu province, on the east coast of China. Immersed in traditional Chinese culture, Wu grew up questioning for advanced knowledge and ideas, and was lucky enough to be the beneficiary of careful guidance from the first generation of physicists in China as she entered the world of science. These predecessors in physics not only laid the foundation for modern physics in China, but also created the Chinese Physical Society. Professor Shiyuan Shi was Wu's thesis advisor when she studied at the National Central University. As the only Chinese graduate student trained by Professor Curie, Shi returned to China after receiving his doctoral degree from the University of Paris, France, in 1933, the year after the founding of the CPS. At the second annual meeting of the CPS, Shi gave a presentation on the magnetic spectrum of a beta radiative element. The presentation was well received by the participants. During the meeting, Shi accepted the appointment of a professor and the dean of the Department of Physics of National Central University. At that time, Shi was only 25 years old and was one of the youngest professors at higher education institutions in China. Shi went on to serve as the chairman of the Jiangsu Society of Physics. During that time, he actively participated in the standardization of physical terms initiated by the CPS, which helped underpin the study of nuclear physics in China. By mentoring Wu, he directly influenced her preference for nuclear physics and the physics experiments. Many years later, in 1947, Shi, together with Professor Zhongyao Zhao, another leading figure of the CPS, recommended Wu to teach at National Central University. Wu later worked at the Institute of Physics of Academia Sinica for a year before she went to the United States to study in 1936. During that time, she worked with Professor Jinghui Gu, China's first female doctor of physics. Gu earned her PhD in physics from the University of Michigan in 1931. She then returned to China to study atomic spectroscopy. In 1932, Gu was appointed as a member of the preparatory committee and the reviewer for the first annual meeting of the CPS. Gu and Wu, two ambitious women in that new era, toiled in the laboratory of the Institute of Physics of Academia Sinica to explore the mystery hidden inside the atoms. Gu encouraged Wu along the way and recommended she study abroad. Wu benefited greatly from that year of research work with Gu. In the years following, whenever she returned to visit her family in China, Wu always brought gifts on her visit to Gu, showing her the utmost respect. This year also marks the 90th anniversary of the CPS. On behalf of the CPS, I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the founders of the Chinese Physical Society, including Shi Shiyuan, Zhao Zhongyao, Gu Jinghui, and Shi Ruwei. They have hindered physics education and physics studies in China. Stick to its mission of promoting the development of popularization of physics. CPS has recognized and passed on the achievements and the character of Professor Wu since early on. Back in 1986, the CPS set up the Zhenxun Wu Physics Award to award the young physicists who have made the most outstanding contribution to experiments. The awarding ceremonies were held at leading institutions in China, including Peking University, Nanjing University, and the Institute of Physics of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. 11 years later, in August 1997, the CPS, Nanjing University, Southeastern University, and the APS jointly organized the international conference in honor of Professor Zhenxun Wu in Nanjing under the theme of physics since the discovery of parity non-conservation. During the era in which Wu lived and worked, physics studies in the United States were entirely dominated by men. As a Chinese woman, Wu was a minority at two levels. Nevertheless, with a genuine love for science, courage, wisdom, and incomparable perseverance, Wu made tremendous accomplishments in her career, won the sincerest admiration of her male counterparts, and created many firsts. In 1958, Wu became the first woman to be a tenured physics professor in the history of Columbia University. In the same year, Wu received the first honorary doctorate awarded to a woman by Princeton University in the university's more than 100 years of history, and was hailed as the world's leading female experimental physicist. In 1973, Wu was appointed the first Pupin Professor of Physics at Columbia University and was dubbed the First Lady of Physics. In 1975, Zhenxun Wu was elected as the president of the APS, becoming the first woman president of a long-time male-dominated organization. At a symposium at MIT in 1964, Wu asked the audience, "I wonder whether the tiny atoms and the nuclear or the mathematical symbols or the DNA molecules have any preference for either masculine or feminine treatment. Science, not silence. A fine example exerts infinite power. It is said that the influence of Madame Curie was the reason for the significantly higher proportion of women scientists in France in the 20th century than other countries. In parallel, the impact of Zhenxun Wu in inspiring young Chinese people, particularly young Chinese women, to dedicate themselves to science cannot be underestimated. Inspired by Wu, the CPS established the Committee of Women in Physics in 2002 as a part of its continuous efforts to create a just and harmonious environment for the physics community and empower more female scientists to a deeper extent. In 2013, the Committee of Women in Physics launched a lecture tour by Chinese women physicists with an aim to paint a picture of the current landscape of women physicists at home and abroad, and encourage more women to study physics and engage in physics research. Successfully held 8 times so far, the tour has become one of CPS signature events. The CPS has also actively supported female scientists to join in the International Alliance of Women Physicists and to make their voices heard in international academic communities and organizations. Taichang, Jiangsu is Wu's hometown and her final resting place. There, crepe myrtle flowers are in blossom with soothing fragrance. In the creep myrtle woods lies Wu's graveyard. Zheng Ningyang inscribed his memorial, and Zheng Daoli designed its layout. As is shown on the slide, the two stone balls symbolizing two cobalt nuclei are placed on the left and the right symmetrically, while the electron distribution as the result of the decay is visualized through asymmetrical water flows to commemorate her epoch-making contributions. During a time when Wu lived and worked before she went to the United States, China was impoverished and the very existence of the Chinese nation was at stake. Studying half a world away, Wu could barely keep contact with her family due to the wars. Despite that, she made significant contributions to the development of physics with her dedication to science and extraordinary wisdom. Professor Wu has made her hometown of Taichang, the Chinese nation, and all women in physics proud. Wu and her husband, Luke Jialiu Yuan, made regular visits to China since the 1970s. Keeping the development of science in China in their hearts, they set up Zheng Xunwu's scholarship with their savings at Nanking University, Southeastern University, and the Mingde School to fund promising talents. Wu was a patriot who never forgot her hometown. The people of her country have honored this outstanding Chinese woman physicist, the uncrowned queen of experimental physics, in many and various ways. Wu dedicated her entire life to the noble cause of science. Her relentless pursuit of truth, impeccable character, perseverance, patriotism, and outstanding contributions to physics have left a glorious mark on the history of humanity's exploration of nature. In short, Professor Jianxun Wu is a phenomenal exemplar of our generation who inspires and motivates us in our endeavor forward. Thank you all for your great attention.